Before we get into tonight's story, the central claim in that headline needs to be tested, not simply repeated. Has China actually entered Canada's tariff war against the United States? Has Beijing imposed new tariffs on American goods, specifically to bombard Americans alongside Canada's own retaliation? We looked for evidence, a new Chinese tariff announcement tied to this specific dispute, a coordinated joint statement, any documented action by China's Ministry of Commerce targeting the U.S. in response to this Canada-U.S. clash. We found none. China has not announced new tariffs on American goods this week, and there is no evidence of direct coordination between Beijing and Ottawa on this specific round of retaliation. What we did find is something more nuanced and, in its own way, more interesting than a fabricated joint attack. Chinese state media has been loudly cheering Canada's retaliation, using language that frames Canada as following China's own playbook. There's a real, growing strategic and economic relationship between China and Canada that predates this dispute and that Trump himself has explicitly threatened Canada over. And there is a real, if indirect, economic effect where Canada's new tariffs on American goods make Chinese products comparatively more attractive to Canadian buyers. None of that amounts to China entering a war or bombarding Americans with tariffs, but it is a genuinely revealing story about how this trade conflict is being watched and used well beyond the two countries directly involved in it. Good evening. Tonight, we are separating what is actually documented from what the more dramatic headlines are implying, and walking through exactly what the real China angle in this story is. Let's start with what actually happened this week between Canada and the United States, because that is the foundation everything else sits on top of. On August 22nd, Canada's 50% tariffs and the earlier U.S. tariffs that triggered this round officially took hold after trade talks between Ottawa and Washington collapsed. On August 25th, Canada's government formally announced its response. Tariffs of 15, 25, and 50% on nearly $28 billion worth of American goods, effective September 8th, focused on steel and aluminum, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, plastics, and electronics. Canada's Finance Minister, François-Philippe Champagne, framed it as a matter of national resolve, saying, "We stand united in our response, we stand united in our resolve, we stand united in fighting for Canada. When Canadians stand together, nothing can stop us." That is the real, confirmed Canada-US portion of this story, and it does not involve China at all. So where does China actually enter the picture? The most direct place is Chinese state media commentary. The Global Times, a Chinese state-affiliated outlet, published an editorial explicitly praising Canada's response, describing it as, in the outlet's own words, a Chinese-styled counterattack, responding firmly and proportionally, defending sovereignty without compromise, and resorting to rules and legitimate countermeasures. The editorial went further, framing Canada's willingness to retaliate against a longtime ally as reflecting what it called an increasingly clear consensus, that no country has the privilege to monopolize the rules or dictate the fate of others. The piece specifically noted that Canada, as a member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance and NATO, had now, in its words, dared to turn against Washington, arguing the significance of that move extends far beyond a North American trade dispute. That editorial is real, it is documented, and it is worth understanding exactly what it is and is not. It is commentary, published in a state-affiliated Chinese outlet, celebrating and rhetorically claiming ownership of a style of response Canada arrived at independently, based on its own trade dispute with the United States that has nothing structurally to do with China's own separate, long-running trade tensions with Washington. Describing Canada's approach as Chinese-styled is a framing choice made by Chinese state media for its own strategic and propaganda purposes, not evidence of coordination, planning, or joint action between the two governments. It is a country's state press using someone else's dispute to make a point about its own worldview, not China entering a war. This is worth understanding as a broader pattern in how state media operates during moments of international friction, not something unique to this specific case. Governments and their affiliated press outlets routinely comment on disputes they are not directly party to, framing other countries' actions in ways that flatter their own narrative or worldview, especially when a third country's dispute with a shared adversary presents a convenient opportunity to do so. China praising Canada's retaliatory approach as validating its own long-standing criticism of American trade policy costs. Beijing, nothing, and requires no actual commitment of resources or diplomatic capital, which is precisely why this kind of rhetorical opportunism is so much easier and more common than genuine coordinated action between governments. Now let's talk about the part of this story that is genuinely substantive, the real documented China-Canada relationship that has been developing independently of this specific tariff clash, because this is where the title's underlying instinct, that something real is going on between these two countries, actually has a foundation. In January of 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney visited China. Following that visit, China and Canada issued a joint statement in which, according to reporting on the visit, The two sides committed to advancing what they called the Canada-China New Strategic Partnership and committed to strengthening the economic and trade partnership between the two countries. Around the same period, on January 16, 2026, China and Canada reached an agreement that saw both sides lower tariffs on certain exports, specifically benefiting Canadian products like canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas, which were shielded from Chinese anti-discrimination tariffs at least through the end of 2026. This is a real, concrete, bilateral economic arrangement between Canada and China, negotiated and announced well before this week's tariff escalation with the United States. It reflects a genuine ongoing effort by Carney's government to diversify Canada's trade relationships beyond its historical, overwhelming reliance on the American market, a strategic direction Carney has described explicitly and repeatedly in public statements throughout 2026. That direction goes back further than this specific China deal, too. In a January 2026 speech at Davos, Carney laid out the thinking behind this shift directly. He said that while American hegemony had historically helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes, in his words, the bargain no longer works. He went on to say, Canada was amongst the first to hear the wake-up call, leading us to fundamentally shift our strategic posture. We are rapidly diversifying abroad, and specifically stated Canada had concluded new strategic partnerships with China and Qatar. That is Carney on the record, explicitly describing a deliberate Canadian strategy of reducing dependence on the United States and building alternative economic relationships, China being one of the most significant examples. This is real. It predates the current tariff clash by months, and it gives meaningful context for why some observers are watching the China-Canada relationship closely right now, even though it is not literally connected to this week's specific round of tariffs. It is worth understanding this diversification strategy in a broader context, too, since Carney's outreach to China is only one piece of a wider pattern. Alongside the China partnership, Carney has also pursued deepened economic and diplomatic ties with other regions, part of what his government has described as building resilience against over-reliance on any single trading partner. A lesson Canadian officials have said explicitly they drew from watching how quickly and how dramatically the American relationship shifted over the course of this 18-month trade war. Positioning China as merely one node within that broader diversification strategy, rather than the singular focus of Canadian foreign economic policy, is an important distinction that gets lost when a headline compresses this entire strategic shift into a simple claim about China and Canada joining forces against the United States. Here is where Washington's own reaction becomes relevant to tonight's story, because Trump himself has already treated the China-Canada relationship as a serious concern well before this week's escalation. Back in January of 2026, Trump threatened to impose a full 100% tariff on Canadian exports if Ottawa, in his words, makes a deal with China. He put it in blunt terms on social media, saying, if Governor Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken. In response, Carney was direct in walking back any suggestion of a broader trade agreement with Beijing, telling reporters that Canada had no intention of pursuing a free trade deal with China, and that Canada respects its obligations under CUSMA, the trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and would not pursue a free trade agreement without notifying the other two parties first. The mere direction of travel, Canada building closer ties with China while locked in an escalating dispute with the United States, was enough to trigger that threat months before this week's collapse and retaliation. Carney's response at the time, explicitly ruling out a free trade agreement while continuing more limited, targeted economic cooperation, like the tariff reductions on specific agricultural exports, reflects the same careful, hedged balancing act we have seen him apply to other high-stakes questions throughout this broader trade war. Now, layering this week's events on top of that earlier context, reporting following Canada's August 25th counter-tariff announcement has connected the dots explicitly. One outlet covering the story directly stated that new tariffs on American goods will make Chinese goods relatively more attractive to Canadian consumers. That is a real logical economic consequence worth understanding clearly. When Canada raises tariffs on a wide range of American products, from steel to electronics to appliances, the relative price of equivalent goods from other countries, including China, becomes more competitive by comparison, simply because the American alternative just got more expensive. This is not China taking any action at all. It is a market effect flowing naturally from Canada's own domestic tariff policy, one that happens to benefit Chinese exporters without China doing anything differently on its end. That distinction matters enormously for understanding what is really happening here. China, benefiting passively from Canada's tariffs on the United States, is a completely different thing from China actively entering the dispute or bombarding Americans with its own coordinated tariffs. The first is simply how trade economics works when one country raises barriers against another. Third countries with competitive products often gain relative market share without lifting a finger. The second would require actual new Chinese government action specifically tied to this dispute, which, as we established at the start of tonight's story, has not happened. It is also worth being clear about the broader context of China's own separate, ongoing tariff relationship with the United States, since that is a genuinely different and parallel story that sometimes gets blended together with this Canada-specific dispute in less careful coverage. China has its own long-running, separate history of tariff actions against the United States, dating back through 2025, including tariffs on American coal, liquefied natural gas, crude oil, agricultural machinery, and vehicles, announced in response to earlier rounds of American tariffs on Chinese goods, entirely independent of anything happening between Canada and the United States. China's Ministry of Commerce has, at various points throughout this broader global trade environment, stated its position that trade and tariff wars have no winners, while still moving forward with its own retaliatory measures when it judged that necessary in its own separate dispute with Washington. That existing separate China-US tariff relationship is real and ongoing, but it is not evidence that China has newly entered or escalated anything specifically because of this week's Canada-US clash. China's own tariff posture toward the United States has followed its own timeline, driven by its own separate set of disputes over technology, market access, and previous rounds of American tariffs targeting Chinese goods specifically, a timeline that long predates and runs independently of whatever is currently happening between Ottawa and Washington. It is worth adding one more layer of nuance here, because the two disputes are not entirely disconnected in a strategic sense, even though they remain procedurally separate. Every additional country the United States finds itself in an active tariff dispute with, whether that is Canada, China, or any of the dozens of other trading partners caught up in tariff actions over the past 18 months, marginally strengthens the position of every other country already in a similar dispute, simply by demonstrating that the United States is willing to escalate broadly rather than negotiating narrowly with each partner individually. In that limited structural sense, China and Canada do share something in common as two of the countries the White House itself has specifically identified as choosing retaliation over quick settlement. But sharing a common structural position within a broader pattern of American trade policy is a very different thing from active coordination or joint action between the two governments. And conflating those two ideas is exactly the kind of imprecision that produces a headline like the one we're examining tonight. So why would a headline claim China has entered Canada's war at all if none of this actually describes coordinated action? There are a few plausible explanations worth naming honestly, because understanding why this kind of framing spreads is itself a useful media literacy exercise. First, the Global Times editorial genuinely does exist, and it genuinely does use dramatic, solidarity-flavored language praising Canada's approach and framing it in explicitly Chinese terms. A headline writer working quickly from that editorial alone could reasonably, if inaccurately, compress state media commentary praising a similar approach into a claim that China itself has joined the fight. The editorial's own language, describing Canada's move as extending far beyond the scope of a North American trade dispute, actively invites that kind of dramatic reading, even though the editorial itself is commentary, not an announcement of new Chinese action. Second, the real documented China-Canada strategic partnership. The January 2026 visit, the joint statement, the tariff reductions on specific agricultural goods, provides a genuine factual foundation that makes a headline like this feel more plausible than if it were invented from nothing. There really is a deepening relationship here. The error is in conflating that separate, months-old, narrower economic relationship with an active, coordinated response to this specific week's tariff dispute, when the timeline and the substance of the two stories do not actually match up that way. Third, Trump's own rhetoric throughout this broader saga has consistently framed Canada's outreach to China as a serious betrayal or threat, using language like drop-off port and threatening tariffs as high as 100% over the mere possibility of a deal. That kind of heightened rhetoric from the American side itself contributes to an environment where any story touching both Canada and China gets naturally read through an adversarial US versus the world lens, even when the underlying facts describe something more limited and more one-sided than an actual joint defensive. Let's also address the bombard Americans with tariffs, half of tonight's title, directly, because that phrase deserves its own scrutiny separate from the China question. The actual bombardment, if you want to use that word at all, is coming entirely from Canada, not China, and it covers the specific list of sectors we described earlier: steel, aluminum, dairy, appliances, agricultural equipment, pulp and paper, plastics, and electronics, worth nearly $28 billion, taking effect September 8th. That is a real, substantial, and accurately described round of retaliation. Attaching the word bombard to China's involvement specifically, when China has taken no new action in this dispute at all, stretches the actual documented record considerably further than the evidence supports. It is worth stepping back and asking what the honest, complete picture actually looks like when you put all of these real pieces together, rather than the compressed, dramatic version implied by tonight's title. Canada and the United States are locked in an escalating, genuinely serious trade war that reached a new peak this week with 50% American tariffs and a matching $28 billion Canadian response. Separately, but not unconnected in spirit, Canada has spent the past year deliberately diversifying its economic relationships away from overwhelming dependence on the United States, a strategy Carney has described explicitly and repeatedly, with China being one meaningful, if carefully limited, part of that diversification effort. Trump has already demonstrated, months before this week's events, that he views any deepening of the Canada-China relationship as a serious provocation, threatening a full 100% tariff over the mere possibility of a free trade deal. Carney has explicitly said Canada has no intention of pursuing. And Chinese state media, watching this entire saga unfold, has seized the opportunity to praise Canada's approach in terms that serve China's own broader narrative about American overreach and unilateralism, without China itself taking any new, documented action tied specifically to this dispute. That is a genuinely rich, multi-layered story, involving real strategic calculations, real economic diversification, real rhetorical opportunism from Chinese state media, and a real American president who has already shown he takes the mere appearance of Canada-China closeness seriously enough to threaten extreme tariff escalation over it. None of that requires inventing a coordinated Chinese tariff bombardment that has not actually happened to make the story compelling. If anything, the honest version is more interesting precisely because it shows how a bilateral dispute between two countries can ripple outward, shape rhetoric in a third country's state media, and factor into strategic calculations in Ottawa and Washington, all without that third country needing to take a single new, concrete action of its own. There is also a forward-looking question worth sitting with as we wrap up tonight, because it is the genuinely uncertain piece of this story rather than something we can resolve definitively based on what has already happened. Given that Trump has already threatened a 100% tariff over the mere possibility of a Canada-China free trade deal, and given that Canada's current round of retaliation against the United States creates a real, if indirect, economic incentive for Canadian buyers and businesses to look more favorably at Chinese alternatives simply as a function of relative pricing, does this week's escalation increase the practical pressure on Carney's government to deepen the China relationship further, even while continuing to publicly rule out anything resembling a formal free trade agreement? That is a real, open strategic question, and it is one worth watching closely in the weeks ahead, not because China has entered anything this week, but because the economic logic created by Canada's own necessary response to American tariffs naturally pushes in a direction that could make the China relationship more, not less, relevant going forward. We will also be watching whether Chinese state media commentary translates into any actual concrete Chinese government action specifically tied to this dispute in the coming weeks, since that would represent a genuine escalation beyond what has been documented so far, rather than the rhetorical solidarity we have seen up to this point. And we will be watching how the September 8th implementation of Canada's new tariffs actually plays out in practice, since the real-world impact of that specific confirmed action will likely matter far more to how this entire saga develops than any editorial commentary from outside the dispute, however dramatically that commentary happens to be framed. There is one more angle worth flagging before we close, since it connects to a pattern this channel has tracked closely throughout this entire 18-month saga. Every time a headline promises a dramatic reaction from a specific party, whether that is Washington panicking over a Canadian energy deal or China entering a war against Trump, the actual documented record has consistently turned out to be more restrained, more procedural, and more strategically calculated than the headline suggests. That does not mean nothing significant is happening. Real strategic shifts, real economic diversification, and real rhetorical positioning are all genuinely underway across this relationship. It means the dramatic framing consistently outpaces the confirmed facts, and separating the two requires exactly the kind of careful, source-by-source verification we have tried to walk through together tonight. So, to bring tonight's story together honestly, China has not entered Canada's war against the United States in the sense of taking any new documented tariff action tied specifically to this week's dispute. What has happened is Chinese state media enthusiastically praising Canada's approach in terms designed to serve China's own broader narrative a real and substantive China-Canada strategic partnership that has been developing since at least January of 2026. Independent of this specific tariff clash, an American president who has already shown he treats that developing relationship as a serious provocation worth threatening extreme tariffs over, and a real, if indirect, market effect where Canada's own tariffs on the United States make Chinese goods comparatively more attractive to Canadian buyers, without China needing to lift a finger to benefit from that shift. Stripped of the dramatic framing, that is a story about strategic hedging, rhetorical opportunism, and market economics, not a story about China bombarding anyone. That is the honest, fully verified version of tonight's story, based on Chinese state media's own published editorial, Carney's own public statements from Davos, and following his January visit to China, Trump's own social media statements from earlier this year, and the confirmed details of Canada's actual August 25th tariff announcement against the United States. If you want to follow how this triangle between Ottawa, Washington, and Beijing actually develops in the weeks ahead, subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you have appreciated the habit of checking a dramatic headline before repeating it, that is exactly why we will keep doing it going forward.